February 14th, 1967, Atlantic Records New York studio late in the evening. The session has run long, the way most of Aretha Franklin's sessions did that winter, because nobody in the room was willing to call it finished until it felt true. A reel of tape spins slowly on a machine in the corner, and through a pair of studio monitors, a playback begins. A song written 2 years earlier by a soul singer from Georgia. A song about a tired man coming home and asking plainly for a little consideration. Except it does not sound like that anymore. The horns hit harder. Two women's voices spell a single word out, letter by letter, over a beat that refuses to apologize for anything. And the voice carrying it all belongs to a 25-year-old woman who has just turned somebody else's plea into something closer to a demand. Nobody in that room needs to be told what they are listening to matters. What almost none of them yet know is that the man who wrote the original version is, at that very moment, still touring the country with a band, still building the career that made respect his in the first place, and that within the year he will be gone. And this new version, her version, will be the one the world remembers. His name was Otis Redding. Her name was Aretha Franklin. And the story of how his song became her anthem is, in its own quiet way, one of the most generous exchanges in the history of American music. Stop to understand why Otis Redding could watch his own song become someone else's signature and respond with something closer to pride than resentment. You have to understand who each of them was before February 1967 ever happened. Otis Redding was born in September 1941 in Dawson, Georgia, and raised in Macon, a city with deep roots in Southern soul and gospel music. He came up singing in church choirs before moving into the rhythm and blues circuit, eventually signing with Stax Records in Memphis, where he became one of the label's defining artists. By the mid-1960s, Redding had built a reputation as one of the most electrifying live performers in American music, known for a raw, urgent vocal style that turned even a simple lyric into something that felt like testimony. Musicians who shared stages with him in those years often described a performer who seemed physically incapable of holding anything back, someone who left every ounce of himself in a room before the final note had even finished ringing out. Audiences who saw him at the Stax Revues in Memphis, or later at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Los Angeles, or at the Monterey Pop Festival in the summer of 1967, came away describing not just a great singer, but something closer to a force of nature contained briefly inside a 3-minute song. In 1965, he wrote and recorded Respect, a song built around a straightforward domestic request. A hard-working man asking his partner for a little consideration and, yes, a little respect, when he finally makes it home at the end of a long day. Redding's version was a modest hit, well regarded within soul music circles, carrying the confident, almost pleading energy of a man who knows exactly what he wants and is simply asking for it directly. It reached the top 20 on the Billboard R&B chart and became a staple of his live shows. A song audiences already recognized and loved well before anyone imagined it might one day mean something else entirely to someone else. Aretha Franklin's path to that same song ran through an entirely different set of rooms. Aretha Louise Franklin was born on March 25, 1942, in Memphis and raised primarily in Detroit, in the home of her father, the Reverend C.L. Franklin, one of the most influential black preachers in America. Gospel royalty moved freely through that house. Mahalia Jackson, Sam Cooke, Clara Ward. And young Aretha absorbed the sound the way a sponge absorbs water, without needing to be taught how. By 14, she was recording gospel albums as a featured soloist. By 18, already a mother of 2, she signed with Columbia Records, where producers tried, with limited success, to mold her into a conventional pop vocalist. The records sold modestly. The voice underneath them, everyone could tell, was reaching for something the arrangements were not built to hold. In 1967, she left Columbia for Atlantic Records, where producer Jerry Wexler flew her down to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to record with a small group of session musicians who cared only about what she actually sounded like, not what the industry assumed a young black woman from Detroit was supposed to sound like. Wexler later said it took him roughly an hour in that studio to understand he was in the presence of something the industry had been failing to properly capture for years. The sessions that followed, first in Muscle Shoals and then continuing in New York, produced some of the most important recordings of her career. Among them, almost inevitably, was Respect. Stop Again. Because what Aretha Franklin did to that song was not a cover in any conventional sense. It was closer to an act of translation, moving the entire meaning of the lyric from one kind of household to another, from one gender's plea to another's demand. In Otis Redding's version, the song is a man's request, sung with warmth and a certain vulnerability, asking a partner not to withhold appreciation for the work he does to provide. Aretha Franklin, working with her sisters Irma and Carolyn in the arrangement, restructured the song almost entirely. She added a driving, insistent backing vocal in which the word respect is spelled out, letter by letter, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, turning a request into something closer to an incantation. She added the now famous "sock it to me" ad-libs, a phrase that entered the American vernacular almost overnight. She shifted the emotional center of gravity of the entire song, so that what had been in Redding's hands, a tired man's plea for consideration, became in hers, an assertive woman's insistence on being valued, on her own terms, with no apology attached. The recording session itself, by most accounts from musicians present, moved with an unusual sense of certainty. Aretha sat at the piano, working out the arrangement's structure in real time with the musicians around her, her sisters harmonizing the backing vocals in a way that felt less rehearsed than instinctive, as though the three of them had been building toward this exact moment for years without knowing it. Producer Jerry Wexler, who had already witnessed her transform other material that year, later described the session as one where the room seemed to organize itself around her. The horn players adjusting their phrasing in real time to match the urgency building in her voice, the drummer tightening the groove almost imperceptibly with each pass until the whole track felt like it was leaning forward. When the horns came in, punctuating the verses with sharp, confident stabs, the song stopped sounding like a plea altogether. It sounded like an ultimatum, delivered with total conviction. There is a particular detail that engineers who worked on the session would recall years later. The way Aretha insisted on keeping a certain rawness in her sister's backing vocals, resisting attempts to smooth or polish the harmonies into something more conventionally pretty. She wanted the spelled-out word to sound the way it might sound shouted across a kitchen table, not the way it would sound rehearsed in a vocal booth for maximum technical precision. That insistence on keeping the performance honest rather than polished would become, in retrospect, one of the defining qualities of nearly everything she recorded for the rest of her career. Released as a single in April 1967, Respect reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 within weeks and became almost instantly something larger than a hit record. It arrived at a moment when the civil rights movement and the emerging women's movement were both searching for language forceful enough to match what they were demanding. And Aretha Franklin's version, without ever mentioning politics directly, gave both movements an anthem they had not known they were waiting for. Organizers at rallies across the country began playing it before speeches, using its rising horns and unmistakable chorus almost as a call to attention. Within the women's movement specifically, the song's transformation of a man's domestic plea into a woman's public demand felt, to many who embraced it, like a kind of blueprint set to music, proof that the same words, spoken from a different position of power, could mean something entirely different. It would go on to win 2 Grammy Awards and be named, decades later, by multiple major music publications as one of the greatest songs ever recorded, a distinction it has held for well over half a century without any serious challenge to that ranking. The song's reach extended even further than its charts and accolades suggest. It became one of the first widely embraced anthems that crossed simultaneously into 2 overlapping but distinct movements, sung at civil rights gatherings and women's rights demonstrations alike, requiring no explanation of which struggle it belonged to because it belonged structurally to both. Few songs in American history have managed that particular kind of dual ownership without losing meaning in either direction. None of this happened in a vacuum, and it did not happen without Otis Redding's knowledge. By the time Aretha's version was climbing the charts, Redding had already heard what had become of his song, and according to numerous accounts from people close to him, His reaction was not bitterness, but something closer to genuine admiration. He reportedly told friends and collaborators, in various forms over the following months, that the song no longer belonged to him, that Aretha Franklin had taken it somewhere he never could have taken it himself, and that he considered this less a loss than a kind of honor. In interviews and retrospectives given by musicians who worked alongside him, Redding is consistently described as having spoken about Aretha's version with something like awe. The professional respect of one serious artist recognizing that another had done something extraordinary with material he had handed over, intentionally or not, into better hands. It is worth pausing on how rare that reaction actually is. The music industry, in any era, is not generally known for graceful acceptance when a song becomes more closely associated with someone other than the person who wrote it. Songwriters have spent careers resenting exactly this kind of eclipse. Otis Redding, by every available account, did not. Perhaps it was because he understood, as a fellow soul singer raised in the same Southern gospel tradition that had shaped Aretha, that a song is never truly finished the moment it is written, that it belongs, in some sense, to whoever can carry it furthest. Perhaps it was simply generosity, the instinct of an artist secure enough in his own considerable talent to celebrate someone else's transformation of his work, rather than mourn the loss of exclusive ownership over it. Whatever the reason, the two of them never had the chance to build much more of a relationship around the song's success. Redding spent much of 1967 riding a genuine career peak of his own, buoyed in part by a widely celebrated performance at the Monterey Pop Festival that June, where he introduced his raw Southern soul sound to a largely white rock audience that had, until that night, known him only by reputation. He was, by every account, in the middle of building toward an even larger stage in American music when, on December 10, 1967, less than 8 months after Aretha Franklin's version of Respect had topped the charts, his small plane went down in icy water near Madison, Wisconsin, killing him along with 4 members of his backing band, the Bar-Kays, and the pilot. He was 26 years old. Only one member of the band, trumpeter Ben Cauley, survived the crash. His own biggest hit, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, a song he had recorded only weeks before his death, was released posthumously the following month and became the first posthumous single to reach #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in American chart history. It remains to this day one of the most quietly devastating listening experiences in popular music. A song about waiting, about watching time pass with no particular plan, recorded by a man who had no idea it would become the way the world remembered him. Stop, one more time, because this is the part of the story that gives the entire exchange its full weight. Otis Redding wrote a song, watched someone else transform it into one of the defining anthems of an entire era, and died within the same calendar year, at 26 years old, never living to see how permanently that transformation would echo through American culture for the following half-century. Aretha Franklin carried the song forward for the rest of her life. She performed Respect at countless concerts across 5 decades, at civil rights commemorations, at presidential inaugurations, at her own induction as the first woman ever admitted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987. Every time she sang it, whether she said so explicitly or not, she was carrying forward a piece of a young man from Macon, Georgia, who had handed her the raw material for an anthem and never asked for it back. The broader arc of Aretha Franklin's career in the years that followed 1967 only reinforced how singular that moment had been. In January 1968, weeks before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, Respect had already become something close to a movement's unofficial theme song, played at rallies and civil rights gatherings across the country. After Dr. King's death that April, Aretha, who had grown up in a household deeply connected to the civil rights movement through her father's friendship with Dr. King, sang Precious Lord, Take My Hand at his funeral in Atlanta, carrying the same voice that had redefined Otis Redding's song into a room heavy with grief that needed, more than anything, something honest to hold on to. In January 1972, at the height of her commercial success, she returned to her father's own New Bethel Baptist Church, not a concert hall, to record a live gospel album with the Southern California Community Choir. Amazing Grace became the best-selling live gospel record in history, proof that the sound she had carried into every secular recording session, including the one that produced Respect, had never actually been separate from the gospel tradition that raised her. The decade that followed brought commercial struggles, as musical tastes shifted and sales declined, but by 1980, under the guidance of producer Clive Davis at Arista Records, she rebuilt her career for a new generation, delivering hits like Freeway of Love and a chart-topping 1987 duet with George Michael that introduced her voice to listeners who had grown up entirely on MTV. In February 1998, given only 20 minutes' notice after opera legend Luciano Pavarotti fell ill before a scheduled Grammy Awards performance, Aretha Franklin walked onto the stage of Radio City Music Hall and delivered Nessun Dorma in her own voice, an aria written for a trained tenor, sung instead by a soul singer who trusted the same instincts that had carried her through every impossible request placed in front of her since childhood. She sang at Barack Obama's first inauguration in January 2009, and in December 2015 at the Kennedy Center Honors, she rose unannounced from her seat in the audience to perform A Natural Woman at a piano no one had told her she would touch, bringing a sitting president to visible tears in front of a stunned room. Through every one of those moments, Respect remained, in a sense, the foundation everything else was built on top of, the song that had first proven, publicly and unmistakably, that Aretha Franklin was capable of taking any piece of material handed to her and finding inside it something the original writer had not fully known was there. Otis Redding gave her the frame. She built, inside that frame, a monument that would outlast both of them. On August 16, 2018, Aretha Franklin died at her home in Detroit, surrounded by family, following a private battle with pancreatic cancer that she had largely kept out of public view. Her funeral in Detroit stretched across nearly 8 hours, filled with musical tributes from artists spanning generations. And among the songs performed and referenced throughout that long, emotional day was, inevitably, Respect, still carrying, more than 50 years after it was recorded, the exact force it had carried the night she and her sisters first worked out its arrangement in a New York studio. Otis Redding's own family and estate have spoken, in the decades since his death, about the pride he took in what Aretha did with the song, and Redding himself remains, alongside her, permanently credited as its writer on every recording, every royalty statement, every retrospective feature written about it. Their names sit together on the same piece of paper, a soul singer from Macon and a preacher's daughter from Detroit, bound together by 3.5 minutes of music that neither of them, at the time they made it, could have fully known would matter this much for this long. There is something quietly instructive in the fact that the two of them never had the chance to fully witness, together, what the song became. Redding died within the year. Franklin carried it for the next 50. And yet the collaboration, unintentional as it was in its final form, remains one of the clearest examples in American musical history of what can happen when one artist's raw material meets another artist's total conviction, not a theft, not a rivalry, but a handoff, generously given and brilliantly carried forward. It is worth imagining, for a moment, what a conversation between the two of them might have looked like had Redding lived another decade. Another 2 decades, long enough to watch the song become a permanent fixture of American cultural memory. Sung at inaugurations and civil rights commemorations and countless ordinary weddings and graduations in between. Would he have felt any different about the transformation than he apparently did in the months immediately following its release? Every available account suggests he would not have. He seemed, from everything people close to him described, to understand instinctively what many songwriters spend entire careers refusing to accept, that letting a song go, fully and without resentment, is sometimes the only way it gets to become something larger than the person who first imagined it. She never spoke about Otis Redding often in interviews, and this account will not invent sentiments she never expressed. What she did, consistently across 5 decades of performances, was sing his song as though it had always belonged to her. And in doing so, she made sure that a young man who died at 26 before he could see the full scope of what he had helped create, would never actually be forgotten. Every time an audience anywhere in the world spells out that single word letter,